At 5 o'clock in the morning, the streets of Nairobi did not wake to silence. They awoke to the thunder of thousands of voices, men and women standing shoulder to shoulder, echoing a call that had been waiting for decades. It was July 7th, the anniversary of Kenya's historic Saba Saba democracy movement, a day remembered for bloodshed and the struggle for freedom. But this year, memory turned into reality again. Protesters filled the avenues demanding an end to corruption, an answer to soaring fuel prices, and justice for the mysterious death of a young activist named Albert O. Wang. For ordinary families, the struggle was painfully real. Savings disappeared in days. Food markets emptied before parents could feed their children, and every trip to the gas station felt like robbery in daylight. Mothers clutched their children's hands tighter. Fathers wondered how much longer they could endure, and young people shouted for a future that seemed stolen before it even began. Then came the order that could have turned anger into massacre. The command was simple: shoot them. Those two words should have unleashed chaos. Instead, something happened that no one expected. Riot police, the iron arm of the state, lowered their rifles. Cameras captured the moment when officers, men trained to obey without hesitation, chose conscience over command. They refused to fire. In that instant, everything changed. The crowd gasped, the government panicked, and the world stopped to ask, why? Why would guardians of the state defy a direct command? Why would young officers risk their careers, their freedom, and perhaps even their lives to protect the very people they were ordered to control? Was it because the protesters were strangers? Or because in the faces of the crowd, they saw neighbors, classmates, even cousins? This moment was not just about Kenya. It was about the fragile line between obedience and morality, authority and humanity. And it raised a question that no nation can ignore. What happens when those sworn to enforce power begin to question its legitimacy? If this story already makes you think of justice, dignity, and family, stay with us until the end. Because what happened on those streets may not only change Kenya, it may shape the destiny of Africa itself. But what drove these men in uniform to turn away from power? What was the breaking point? On July 7th, the anniversary of Kenya's pro-democracy struggle, the country stood at a crossroads. What began as a commemoration quickly transformed into the largest protest in recent years. Tens of thousands of citizens filled Nairobi's streets, chanting against corruption, soaring fuel costs, and the government's failure to protect its people from the crushing weight of inflation. Kenya's economy had spiraled beyond the reach of the ordinary man. Prices of basic goods like maize flour doubled within months. Inflation surged past 8%, and fuel, once affordable for middle-class families, reached record highs. Many who had once managed to send their children to school or maintain a small business now faced ruin. Anger was not abstract. It was written on the hungry faces of families, on the empty shelves of markets, and in the stories of workers who could no longer afford the commute to their jobs. For months before this day, Kenya's police force had already been under fire for its heavy-handed response to public dissent. Dozens of lives had been lost in previous crackdowns, each incident leaving deeper scars on the fragile trust between people and the state. The police, once considered protectors, had become a symbol of fear. When the command arrived on this July morning to shoot at the legs of those who destroyed property or refused to disperse, everyone understood what that meant. It was a thinly veiled order to use live ammunition on unarmed civilians. In past years, such a directive would have been executed without hesitation. This time, something very different happened. In front of cameras, in full view of chanting crowds, riot police paused. Their fingers hovered near their triggers, but their eyes drifted over the faces in front of them. Many officers were young recruits, barely older than the protesters they were confronting. Among the crowd were not nameless strangers. They saw classmates holding signs, neighbors calling for justice, even family members standing defiantly in the street. One officer later admitted anonymously to a journalist, "When I raised my weapon, I saw my cousin in the front row. In that moment, I knew I could not pull the trigger." Then, as if on cue, rifles lowered. One officer turned away, then another, until entire lines of uniformed men stepped back. The act was silent, but its power thundered across the square. Cameras rolled. Within hours, they spread across TikTok, X, and Facebook. By the end of the second day, over 20 million people had watched the footage of Kenyan police refusing to shoot. Hashtags like "Police for the People" and "Kenya Mutiny" trended globally. For a nation accustomed to violence at the hands of authority, the sight was astonishing. The enforcers of the state chose restraint instead of repression. This refusal was not just about morality. It was also about survival. Kenya's penal code and international treaties the country had signed made it clear that just following orders would not protect an officer from prosecution if lethal force was misused. Human rights groups reminded law enforcement that international law required accountability and that firing on unarmed civilians could land individual officers in court. For many in uniform, the calculation was simple. Loyalty to their commanders could not outweigh the risk of prison or the weight of conscience. The government scrambled to contain the crisis. Officials hastily denied that any order to shoot had ever been given, blaming doctored recordings and what they called malicious disinformation. Yet their words were drowned out by the undeniable power of video evidence. Clips of officers lowering their rifles were replayed on national television, on international news, and on millions of personal phones. The government's denials rang hollow. But the heart of the story lay not in official statements, but in the personal cost carried by those who stood in the square that day. Consider a mother of 3 selling vegetables at a roadside stall. She had joined the protest not as a politician, but as a desperate citizen. When she saw the officers lower their weapons instead of firing, she wept openly. "For the first time," she told a reporter, "I felt the police were with us, not against us." That single act of refusal became, in her eyes, the most powerful statement of hope she had ever witnessed. The clash between obedience and conscience had reached its breaking point. A police force long seen as the iron fist of authority suddenly showed the face of humanity. And in doing so, they shook the very foundation of state power. But if the guardians of order can choose conscience over command, what happens next? Will their defiance inspire reform, or will it trigger a backlash that threatens to tear Kenya apart? The decision of the police to lower their rifles was not the end of the story. In many ways, it was only the beginning. Within hours of the mutiny, Kenya's government moved into damage control. A hastily arranged press conference was broadcast across the country. Officials stood before cameras and flatly denied that any order to shoot had ever been issued. They claimed that doctored audio and misleading video clips were being spread online to weaken public trust. One spokesperson insisted, There was no command to kill innocent civilians. But the officials avoided any direct mention of the widely circulated images that showed riot police clearly lowering their weapons in front of protest crowds. The problem for the government was that their words could not compete with the pictures already burned into the minds of millions. Human rights groups immediately rejected the official narrative. Amnesty International's Kenya chapter cited eyewitness testimony and time-stamped footage from multiple protest sites, all showing officers receiving explicit orders to use force. Their legal director went further, warning that such directives, if confirmed, would represent a violation of both Kenyan law and international conventions on human rights. She declared, "This is not simply a moral issue. This is about legality. Someone will have to answer for it." Inside the police force itself, a quiet but powerful storm was building. Officers who had refused to obey were not isolated. Reports surfaced that other units, even in regions far from Nairobi, were now questioning the chain of command. Senior police union officials met behind closed doors to discuss liability. They knew Kenya's penal code and international treaties imposed individual responsibility. In other words, just following orders could not shield them from prosecution. For many officers, that realization was the breaking point. Blind loyalty to the uniform could no longer outweigh personal conscience and the very real risk of prison. The crisis quickly spilled into Kenya's courts. Within 48 hours, a coalition of lawyers filed an urgent petition demanding an independent investigation into the police orders. They cited specific clauses in the Constitution that guaranteed the right to peaceful assembly and strictly limited the use of lethal weapons. Judges faced mounting pressure to act as the protests showed no sign of slowing and public anger continued to grow. International observers began to take notice. The African Union's Commission on Human and People's Rights issued a statement calling for transparency. Several Western embassies expressed concern over the erosion of public trust in Kenya's security institutions. Behind the scenes, diplomats worried that instability in Nairobi could ripple outward into a region already facing economic hardship and extremist threats. But perhaps the most powerful reaction came from the streets themselves. Within days, hashtags like Kenya Mutiny and Police for the People trended across the continent. Young activists framed the refusal as a moral awakening, while government loyalists called it dangerous insubordination. Opinion polls revealed a divided nation. 54% of respondents praised the officers for their courage and humanity. 38% expressed fear that defiance within the ranks could lead to chaos or embolden criminals. The remaining 8% were unsure of what to believe. As debate raged, a leaked internal memo revealed that officials were considering disciplinary action against the mutinous officers. Instead of calming the situation, the news fueled further outrage. Social media exploded with posts defending the police. One viral comment read, "You cannot punish men for choosing not to kill their brothers and sisters." Across the nation, many saw the officers' actions as a rare moment of moral clarity in a system often accused of brutality. Symbolically, the refusal struck a deep chord beyond Kenya. Across Africa, the images resonated as a vision of what self-determination might look like. For once, security forces chose restraint over repression. Commentators pointed out that this was the opposite of the usual narrative where authority crushes dissent. Here, authority stepped aside. The moment carried a symbolic power that no speech could match. The government now faced a dilemma: punish the officers and risk further inflaming public anger, or ignore their disobedience and appear weak in the eyes of loyalist forces. Behind closed doors, senior officials debated furiously. Some pushed for harsher penalties, warning that leniency could open the door to further mutinies. Others argued that brutal discipline could backfire, creating martyrs out of the very officers who refused to kill. Either choice carried enormous risk. What happened in those days was more than a standoff between protesters and police. It became a direct confrontation between state authority and public morality. The moment officers chose conscience over command, the balance of power shifted. The world now waited to see what would come next. Would Kenya seize this fragile opportunity to reform its security forces and rebuild trust? Or would the government double down on control and push the country toward deeper instability? The decision of riot police to lower their rifles created shockwaves far beyond the protest squares of Nairobi. What began as a single moment of defiance quickly became the subject of national debate, pulling families, churches, schools, and political leaders into one of the most urgent conversations in Kenya's modern history. On the streets, opinion was divided. Local polls showed that a majority of citizens, especially younger generations, praised the officers for their courage. They saw the refusal to fire as proof that conscience could triumph over cruelty. Yet many older Kenyans expressed concern. They worried that once discipline breaks inside the police, the country could slide into lawlessness. If officers can ignore one order today, what will stop them from ignoring others tomorrow? Asked a shopkeeper in downtown Nairobi. These fears reflected a generational divide. Young people shaped by global social media and inspired by Pan-African movements were eager for reform. Older citizens, scarred by decades of instability, longed for order above all else. Inside homes, families debated late into the night. In churches and mosques, sermons asked whether the police should be instruments of fear or guardians of peace. One pastor told his congregation, "When men in uniform chose not to shoot their neighbors, they reminded us of a truth we often forget. The role of authority is to protect, not to destroy." Such words echoed across the nation, giving voice to a longing for a more humane security culture. The ripple effects reached deep into Kenya's political system. Opposition leaders seized on the moment, praising the police for their restraint and framing the refusal as evidence of a government that had lost touch with its people. Pro-government politicians countered that politicizing the mutiny would weaken the state and embolden criminals. In Parliament, heated arguments broke out over whether the events represented a moral awakening or a dangerous collapse of authority. Civil society leaders called for urgent reforms. They demanded the creation of a fully independent police service, free from political interference and accountable directly to the people. Human rights organizations argued that the mutiny revealed a system broken by decades of impunity. They insisted that a new model of policing was needed, one rooted in negotiation and respect for civilian rights. "If officers are willing to lay down their guns to avoid harming citizens," one activist said, "then the state must meet them halfway and create structures that protect both officers and the people they serve." The consequences were not limited to institutions. Among ordinary citizens, something profound shifted. For many, the police were no longer faceless enforcers of state power. They became human beings caught in the same struggles of economic hardship and political neglect as the protesters themselves. A mother of 3, who joined the demonstration simply because she could no longer afford food for her children, described the moment she saw an officer lower his rifle. "I felt hope for the first time in years," she said, her voice trembling. "That man could have taken my life. Instead, he chose to stand with me." This emotional shift was powerful. Demonstrations began to change in tone. What once looked like confrontation started to resemble fragile moments of dialogue. Some protesters began addressing police officers as brothers and sisters rather than enemies. For the first time, there was a glimpse of what trust between citizens and security forces could look like. Yet this fragile new relationship carried risks. The government, fearful of losing control, considered harsh disciplinary measures against the mutinous officers. A leaked memo suggested suspensions and even criminal charges. News of these plans provoked outrage, sparking further protests and calls for justice. Public opinion hardened against the state, and trust in official narratives eroded even further. At the same time, voices of caution grew louder. Security analysts warned that if discipline continued to erode, Kenya's stability could collapse. Criminal networks, extremists, and opportunists might exploit a weakened police force. The country could descend into chaos if reform was not handled carefully. In this tense environment, Kenya stood at a crossroads. On one path lay reconciliation, reform, and the rebuilding of trust between citizens and their guardians. On the other path lay polarization, mistrust, and the possibility of violent breakdown. Which path would Kenya choose? And more importantly, how would the United States and other global powers react if one of Africa's most strategic nations found itself on the brink of institutional fracture? The mutiny in Kenya did not remain a local story for long. Within days, foreign governments began to weigh in, each aware of the stakes involved. Kenya is not just another African nation struggling with internal unrest. It is one of the continent's most important allies in counterterrorism operations, a gateway for international trade routes, and a hub for humanitarian and development programs. What happens in Nairobi can ripple across the Horn of Africa and beyond. For the United States, the crisis struck at the heart of its strategic interests. Washington has invested heavily in Kenya's security apparatus, from training police officers to funding anti-terror operations that protect American interests in the region. The sight of Kenyan police refusing orders raised uncomfortable questions for American policymakers. If loyalty inside Kenya's security forces could fracture, how reliable would Kenya remain as a partner in the fight against extremism? Would instability in Nairobi jeopardize broader security goals across East Africa? Western diplomats also expressed quiet concern over the role of economic pressures. For years, Kenya has been encouraged by international institutions to cut subsidies and restructure its economy. The result has been higher fuel prices and harsher living conditions for ordinary citizens. Many protesters pointed directly to these policies as a source of their suffering. For Washington and its allies, this meant the crisis was not only political, but also deeply tied to the global economic system in which they play a leading role. Meanwhile, international organizations like the African Union called for transparency and accountability. Human rights bodies across Europe and Africa demanded an independent investigation into the government's actions. In foreign capitals, newspapers framed the event as a turning point for African governance. Commentators asked whether this was the beginning of a moral shift, where even the enforcers of state power would no longer obey unjust commands. For the United States, the deeper fear was not only about Kenya. If the refusal to fire spread as an idea across Africa, it could embolden security forces in other countries to question orders. Such a wave of defiance might destabilize allies and reshape the balance of power on the continent. Was this the start of a larger crisis that could undermine American influence in Africa? Or was it the birth of a new order in which conscience and morality outweighed blind obedience? The silence that followed the mutiny was louder than any gunfire. Across Kenya, people realized that a single act of restraint had changed the course of their nation's story. Yet the questions that remain are as heavy as the rifles that were lowered. Would this defiance be remembered as a spark of moral courage, or would it be buried under political reprisals and government denials? The risk is real. If the Kenyan government chooses punishment and repression, the fragile trust between citizens and security forces could collapse entirely. The result might be more unrest, deeper polarization, and a dangerous vacuum where law and order are replaced by fear and uncertainty. But if leaders choose to listen, if they take this act of conscience as a call to reform, Kenya could emerge stronger. It could become an example of how justice and dignity can guide a nation through crisis. The implications stretch far beyond Nairobi. From Nigeria to South Africa, and from the Sahel to the Horn of Africa, people are watching closely. Citizens and security forces alike are asking themselves whether authority can survive without trust, and whether legitimacy can exist without morality. If one group of officers can refuse unjust orders, what will happen when others are faced with the same choice? The future remains uncertain. Perhaps this moment will fade into history as a brief rebellion that changed nothing. Or perhaps it is the beginning of a deeper shift, one that redefines power across Africa and forces even the strongest governments to reckon with the conscience of their people. If regional leaders cannot adapt, and if institutions like the African Union cannot provide a framework for reform, instability may spread. And for the United States, the question becomes unavoidable. How will Washington respond if one of its closest partners in East Africa becomes the testing ground for a new moral order? If this story has made you pause and reflect, then let your voice be part of this conversation. Share your thoughts with those around you. If you believe in justice, in dignity, and in the value of human life, let this moment remind you that no command is greater than conscience. And if you pray, ask God to bless Kenya, to bless Burkina Faso, and to bless a continent rising to claim its future. The next chapter is not written yet. Will Africa's leaders cling to fear, or will they choose hope? That answer depends not only on them, but on us all.